I am standing in the front hall of Rowan House, while my uncle tells 40 people I was never meant to walk through its doors. My Uncle Walter said it calmly, the way men like him always did when they wanted cruelty to sound like fact. My cousin Natalie stood beside him, with a champagne glass in one hand and the guest list in the other, and neither of them looked ashamed. They told everyone gathered for the unveiling that my mother had never been a real Rowan, that I had spent years clinging to a family story that did not belong to me, and that tonight was for descendants only. I had walked there in my best coat, with my mother's old bracelet in my purse, and enough hope to embarrass myself. I never needed their approval to become who I was meant to be. If this story touched you, consider subscribing and sharing it with someone who needs to hear it today. My name is Nora Bennett, and by the time I was 32, I had already learned that some families do not throw you out all at once. They do it by inches. A chair placed too far from the table. A birthday card signed only with a last name. A family photograph taken while you were still in the kitchen carrying plates no one asked your cousin to carry. The Rowans had been doing that to my mother for as long as I could remember. My mother, Rebecca Bennett, was the daughter of Pearl Rowan. Or at least, that was the story my mother had lived by and died by. The family's version was colder. They said Pearl had been taken in as a child by my great-grandmother Eleanor Rowan after some private tragedy no one wanted to discuss. They called it charity when they wanted to sound graceful. They called it confusion when they wanted to sound practical. They called it a misunderstanding when they wanted to make my mother feel foolish for asking why her own last name had once been written in Eleanor's Bible in the same careful ink as everyone else's. I grew up in a small river town where everybody knew which houses still carried old money and which people were expected to enter through the side door. Rowan House sat on a hill at the edge of downtown, with white columns that needed repainting every spring, and a porch that always smelled faintly of cedar after rain. When I was a little girl, a large portrait used to hang above the main staircase. It showed Eleanor Rowan in a pale dress, one hand resting on the carved back of a chair, her face turned slightly toward the light. But what I remembered most were her eyes. Even as a child, I thought they looked less like a painted woman's eyes, and more like the eyes of someone trying very hard not to say something out loud. When I was 9, the portrait disappeared. I asked my mother where it had gone, and she only said Walter had sent it away for storage after an old leak damaged the frame. Then she folded a dish towel in half, too carefully, and changed the subject. That was how truth moved in our family. Never straight toward the light, always sideways. Walter Rowan was not my mother's brother by blood, but he spoke as though he had inherited the right to define everyone else's blood. His mother, Agnes Rowan, had been Eleanor's publicly acknowledged daughter. My grandmother Pearl had been the daughter people lowered their voices around. By the time I was old enough to understand what that meant, my grandmother was already dead, buried in the older section of the cemetery, beneath a stone that said only, Pearl Bennett, beloved mother. No maiden name, no Rowan. Walter liked order. He liked lists, plaques, donor boards, and local history luncheons where his name could be thanked into a microphone. He also liked Natalie, his only child, to be seen as the natural continuation of everything that mattered. She was 2 years older than me, beautiful in the polished way some people become when the whole room has spent years reflecting them back kindly. At family dinners, Walter asked Natalie about graduate school, travel, and real estate. He asked me if I was still doing clerical things. I worked at the town library then. I shelved books, managed archives no one cared about until they needed a death certificate copied, and sat at a metal desk beneath a vent that rattled every winter. I liked the work. It was quiet, and quiet had always felt safer than being noticed. My mother died in early March, 2 years before that night in the front hall. Cancer is such a simple word for what it does to a house. It takes the sound out of it first. After her funeral, I sorted her things alone, because Walter claimed Rowan House was too busy to host a reception branch for extended family. That was the phrase he used. Extended family. As though my grief needed a waiting room. Inside one of my mother's sewing tins, beneath buttons and bent needles, I found a child's bracelet wrapped in tissue paper. It was silver, no bigger than the width of my palm, with a tiny clover charm darkened by age. I had never seen it before. There was no note with it, but I kept it anyway, because grief makes historians out of ordinary people. You start saving things you do not understand, in case understanding comes later. That summer, workers repairing water damage in the west wing of Rowan House found the old portrait sealed behind cedar paneling in a narrow wall cavity near the upstairs landing. The local paper ran a photograph of Walter, smiling beside the canvas, while dust still coated the frame. The article called it a remarkable find, and said the piece would be unveiled at a centennial benefit for the town historical society after light conservation work. They did not call me. Natalie posted a filtered picture of the portrait on social media with a caption about legacy and preservation. Comments from people in town poured in under it. Beautiful. Chills. History alive again. I stared at Eleanor Rowan's painted face on my screen and felt that old unease climb up my arms. Her eyes still looked like they were holding something back. A week before the unveiling, I asked Walter if I could attend. He did not answer my message. So I drove up there anyway on a cool October evening with wind pushing leaves across the road in thin copper lines. Rowan House was lit from end to end. Cars filled the gravel circle. Men in dark coats and women in long dresses moved through the front hall, carrying wine and small talk. I stood just inside the doorway for maybe 10 seconds before Natalie saw me. Her smile never reached her eyes. "You weren't invited," she said. "I came to see the portrait," I told her. Walter crossed the room before she could say anything else. He did not raise his voice. That was the worst part. He simply placed one hand over the guest list in Natalie's grasp and told the people nearest him, loud enough for everyone else to hear. Nora still struggles to understand that family stories do not become true just because you repeat them. There were people from church there, a county commissioner, 2 women who had brought casseroles when my mother got sick. No one stepped in. I said, "My mother belonged here." Walter looked at me the way he used to look at invoices he thought were padded. "Your mother was cared for by this family," he said. "That is not the same thing." Natalie added, "Please don't make a scene over something that was settled before either of us was born." The betrayal was not that they believed the lie. It was that they wanted it said in public, in a bright room, under a chandelier, so it would harden into something official. I left before my face could give them anything. In the parking area beside the side garden, I stood under the bare branches of an old dogwood tree and cried once, hard and fast, like the body wanted to get it over with. Then I got in my car and drove back to my apartment above Miller's Pharmacy, where the pipes knocked in the walls every time the upstairs tenant showered. I packed a suitcase, 2 boxes of books, my mother's sewing tin, and the framed photograph of us at the county fair when I was 14. By morning, I was on the road to Columbus with $347 in my checking account and no plan beyond not staying where I had been humiliated. Grief is heavy enough without having to prove you deserve to carry it. The first winter in Columbus felt like punishment. I rented a thin-walled apartment above an old bakery that opened at 5 every morning and filled the hall with the smell of yeast and sugar before sunrise. For a while, that smell was the only comforting thing in my life. I found work at a custom framing shop on the east side, owned by a man named Harold Pike, who wore reading glasses low on his nose and believed every old document should be handled like it still had feelings. I learned quickly. Matting, backing, glass, acid-free sleeves, surface cleaning, paper repair. The slow, patient work of helping damaged things survive a little longer. At night, I ate soup from a chipped blue bowl and sat at the kitchen table going through my mother's papers. Bills, recipes, a church bulletin folded into quarters. One Christmas card from Pearl's old friend Edna Foster, already dead by then. A county fair ribbon. Nothing that settled anything. Nothing that told me why my grandmother had been denied her own name. Months passed. I sent out applications for better work twice a week and got rejections often enough that the language began to repeat itself in my sleep. Not the right fit. We have moved forward with another candidate. We wish you the best. Some nights I pressed my thumb into the edge of the table just to feel something exact and manageable. Then Harold let me take on a small preservation job of my own. A woman brought in a box of letters her husband had written from overseas 50 years earlier. The envelopes were brittle, the ink fading. I spent 3 evenings humidifying creases, flattening pages, and rehousing everything in archival sleeves. When she came back, she cried before she even opened the box. That was the first time I understood that my life might not need to be large to be meaningful. But I wasn't prepared for what happened next. A few weeks later, the woman told her pastor about me, and the pastor asked whether I could help stabilize old church ledgers damaged by a basement flood. It was careful work and not glamorous, but it paid enough to catch up on 2 utility bills and replace the boots I had resold twice. The spring after that, I started taking side jobs under my own name. Bennett Paper and Frame. Nothing fancy, just a one-room studio subleased behind a florist, with a second-hand table, a lamp that buzzed when I turned it on, and a hand-painted sign I made myself because I could not afford printed vinyl. There is a special kind of loneliness in eating alone in a room you pay for yourself after spending your whole life being told you would never make it on your own. The meal can be simple. Bread and tea, soup from yesterday, half an apple if that is what is left. But the silence around it feels different. It stops sounding like abandonment and starts sounding like peace. By the 3rd year, I had regular clients, small museums, 2 law offices that needed wills and deeds rehoused, families with letters, diplomas, war photographs, and brittle certificates no one else knew how to keep. I was not wealthy. I was not even comfortable all the time. One burst pipe in February nearly cost me the studio, and a summer slump had me counting quarters for gas. But the work was mine. Every dollar came in quietly. Every month I stayed afloat felt like a sentence my family had once spoken over me being proven wrong without me needing to answer it. I learned early that dignity is not dramatic. Most days it looks like paying rent on time and not calling the people who taught you to doubt yourself. 7 years passed that way. I moved once into a small brick apartment near Franklin Park with windows that faced west. In the late afternoon, light pooled on the floorboards and made even my plain furniture look warmer than it was. I hired part-time help, a steady college student named Mara, when the workload outgrew my hands. I paid off my oldest debt. I bought decent coffee instead of the cheapest kind. On hard days, I still opened my mother's sewing tin and turned the little silver bracelet over in my palm. I never stopped wondering why she had hidden it. Then came the rumor. One afternoon, an older client from my hometown stopped by the studio to collect restored land records and said she had heard Walter telling people I had gone to Columbus because I expected to squeeze money out of the Rowan estate one day. She said he laughed when he told it. Said Natalie laughed too. I nodded, wrapped her documents, and walked her to the door. After she left, I stood in the studio with my hand on the lock and felt anger move through me. Not hot and wild like it had when I was younger, but colder, more finished. Walter still needed me to be grasping and unstable because anything else would have required him to reconsider himself. What I learned the following week changed everything. Her name was Ruth Keller, and she called on a rainy Thursday just before closing. She introduced herself as a conservator working with the County Historical Museum back home. The Rowans, she explained, had finally loaned Eleanor Rowan's portrait for full cleaning and documentation ahead of a regional exhibit on early 20th century women in civic life. My first instinct was to end the call. Instead, I listened. "I found your studio through a referral from Harold Pike," she said. "He mentioned you're originally from Marlowe County." I said I was. There was a pause. Rain tapped the windows beside my desk. "I think you should come see something," Ruth said. I drove down on Saturday. The museum conservation room was colder than I expected, bright with overhead lights and metal tables. Ruth Keller was in her 50s, with clipped gray hair and the calm manner of someone who had spent years working slowly around damaged things. The portrait stood on an easel behind her. Eleanor Rowan looked older than I remembered from the newspaper photographs, less glamorous, more tired around the mouth. Ruth did not begin with pleasantries. "We noticed almost immediately that the surface around the upper right quadrant had been heavily reworked," she said. "Not by the original artist, much later." She handed me a magnifying loupe and directed me toward the face. "At the eyes," she said. Up close, I could see what she meant. The irises had a depth cameras never caught. In each pupil there was a tiny reflected shape, small enough to miss unless you were inches away. One shape was the bright edge of a window. The other was stranger, a pale curve, a ribbon maybe. And below it, the suggestion of a small hand lifted near the subject's skirt. I pulled back and looked at Ruth. "We ran infrared imaging," she said. "There was another figure standing beside Eleanor in the original composition. A child. She was painted out later, but not completely. The reflections in the eyes were never altered." My mouth went dry. Ruth set a printout on the table. The infrared image was grainy but clear enough. Eleanor stood as she did in the visible portrait, but beside her, half hidden by time and overpaint, was a little girl of maybe 4 or 5. One arm lifted. At the wrist was a dark spot where a bracelet had once caught light. I was already opening my purse before I understood I was doing it. The silver clover bracelet lay cool in my palm when I set it beside the printout. Ruth stared at it, then back at the image. "That," she said softly, "is not a coincidence." For a moment, I could not speak. I could see my mother's sewing tin, her careful hands, the way she had hidden this small thing without explanation, as though she feared the truth more than losing it. Ruth went to the back of the canvas and touched a section of newer brown paper that had been lifted during treatment. There was more. Beneath the replacement backing, taped flat against the stretcher, the museum had found an old shipping card from the original frame maker. The ink was faded, but not beyond reading. Eleanor Rowan with daughter Pearl, June 1926. I did not sit down, because if I had, I might not have gotten back up. Ruth told me Walter had visited the museum after the first treatment notes were filed. He had asked pointed questions about the reporting. He had wanted to know whether the odd visual artifacts in the eyes needed to be included in the final catalog essay. He had also signed the original loan paperwork using a copied inventory description that called the work simply Portrait of Eleanor Rowan, despite the older card naming Pearl outright. His own papers had begun to betray him. The truth doesn't always arrive when you want it. It arrives when it's ready. Ruth showed me one final item, a donor file note from 19 years earlier, when Walter had first inquired about donating the portrait for tax appraisal. In his own handwriting, on museum letterhead, he had written, "Child figure, likely Pearl, per grandfather's notation, but family prefers current title." Family prefers current title. I read that sentence 3 times. There are wounds that come from cruelty, and then there are wounds that come from administration. A signature, a label, a line altered on purpose. My mother had not been erased by accident. Someone had maintained the erasure year after year and called it order. Ruth asked what I wanted to do. I looked at Eleanor Rowan's painted face again. Even after a century, even after overpainting, even after being hidden behind a wall, her eyes had kept the child. "I want the truth documented," I said. "Nothing more." Ruth nodded as though she had expected exactly that. A final meeting was arranged at Rowan House the following Friday because the museum would not proceed with exhibition materials while there was a dispute over the work's title and provenance. The local historical board came. So did Walter, Natalie, their attorney, and 2 trustees from the family foundation that oversaw the property. Rain started just before noon and streaked the porch railings dark. By the time I arrived, my heartbeat had settled into something almost calm. I wasn't there to fight. I wasn't there to argue. I was there for one reason only. The same front hall where Walter had humiliated me smelled of polished wood and damp coats. No music this time. No champagne. Just folders, umbrellas, and a folding screen set up for Ruth's presentation. Natalie would not quite meet my eyes. Walter did, but only with irritation, as if my presence itself were a procedural inconvenience. Ruth began with the conservation sequence: surface cleaning, pigment analysis, infrared imaging, close photography. She spoke carefully and without drama. Then she projected the enlargement of Eleanor's eyes. The room changed. Even people who did not understand art could understand what they were seeing. In the magnified pupils, the reflected child was unmistakable once pointed out. The next slide showed the infrared underdrawing. The next showed the shipping card. And then Ruth laid Walter's donor inquiry on the table, the sentence visible in black and white. Child figure likely Pearl, per grandfather's notation, but family prefers current title. Walter said, "That note proves nothing about lineage." His attorney shifted in his chair. One of the trustees, a retired judge named Elaine Foster, asked whether there were other supporting materials. Ruth slid forward the copied inventory list from Walter's late father's estate papers, recovered from museum files, where the same work was listed as Eleanor Rowan, with Pearl, nursery portrait. Then Elaine asked Walter whether he had known of these descriptions when he publicly described Pearl as unrelated to the family line. He did not answer at first. Natalie did. She looked at the table, not at me, and said quietly, "Dad told me it was better this way. He said old scandals ruin everybody." No one moved. Walter's face changed then, not into shame exactly, but into the hollow look of someone realizing that control had left the room without asking permission. He tried one last time. "Pearl was raised here," he said. "That does not mean every branch that followed gets to claim this house." Elaine folded her hands. "No one is claiming the house today," she said. "We are correcting the record." That was all I had wanted. There are moments you imagine for years and still fail to predict. I thought I would feel vindicated. I thought I would feel anger burning off me like fever. What I felt instead was tired, and then lighter than tired. As if I had been carrying a locked box so long I had forgotten the shape of my own hands without it. Walter finally looked at me. "What do you want?" I took the family register Ruth had brought from the study table, where names had been entered in generations of fading ink. Beside Pearl's line, there had once been a blank notation. That day, under Elaine Foster's direction, the clerk added Rowan in full and wrote Rebecca Rowan Bennett beneath it. My mother's name. Clear, permanent, not hidden in a tin, not spoken in whispers. I said, "Put the truth where people can see it." Nothing more. Natalie began to cry, though softly enough that it sounded almost private. Ruth closed her folder. Rain moved against the tall windows in long silver threads. No one apologized. That mattered less than I once thought it would. Some doors close with anger. The hardest ones close softly. When the meeting ended, Walter stepped onto the porch a few seconds after I did. The rain had slowed to a mist, and the yard below the hill looked blurred around the edges. For a moment, we stood side by side with several feet of old wood between us. He said, "Your mother should have brought this to me." I kept my hand on the wet railing and looked out at the road. "She spent her whole life bringing it to you," I said. "You just preferred another story." That was the only sharp thing I ever said to him. He did not answer. I walked down the porch steps with the corrected register copy in my bag and the little silver bracelet fastened around my wrist for the first time in my life. At the edge of the drive, I turned once, not to look at Walter, but to look at the upstairs landing window where the portrait had once hung. For years, I had thought being erased meant being forgotten. It doesn't. It means someone worked to remove you because your existence disturbed the shape of their version. My mother had disturbed that version simply by being true. I drove back to Columbus before dark. The highway was wet, the sky opening in pale bands over the fields, and my phone stayed silent in the passenger seat. I did not need it to ring. I did not need an apology arranged in better words than the ones I had already lived without. The next week, the museum issued its revised catalog entry and titled the work Eleanor Rowan with Daughter Pearl. They sent me a copy in the mail. I placed it in my desk drawer beside the sewing tin and left it there, not because I was hiding it, but because I no longer needed to hold it every day. The strongest things in a life are not always the loudest ones. That evening, I stood by my apartment window while the last of the rain slid down the glass and the city lights came on one by one across the street. I touched the bracelet once, then let my hand fall still. Outside, the wet pavement held the sky a little longer before giving it back.